Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Hope you're well. Hope you're having a nice evening. Shavua Tov, as uh, as we like to say. So, a few people asked me to record my sermon from this Shabbat. Now, obviously, you're not going to get the poise and the energy that I usually use to deliver a Shabbat sermon. For that, you're going to have to come in person on a Shabbat. But it seemed that today's sermon really struck a chord with a lot of people. So I figured I would just kind of free flowing talk about what I spoke about today. This week has been a week about the hostages. First of all, thank God the billboards that we were involved with, thanks to an anonymous partner and so many people who helped out, they went up this week. The billboards all over Montreal, 53 billboards went up to really bring awareness here in the city to the crisis facing the hostages. Then there were obviously the 290,000 people who gathered in Washington, beautiful event uh, for the hostages, to bring awareness there for the hostages. Chabad this week chartered an El Al flight from Ben Gurion with 150 family members of the hostages to first go and pray in New York. And then for the first time, actually, El Al did a domestic US flight from New York to Washington. And while 290,000 people were convening on Washington, the families of the hostages were going to Congress and to the Senate and speaking to them about the plight. And so, being that this has been the conversation, and rightfully so, this should be the conversation, I'd like to talk about a number of things today. Number one is the idea of what can we do. Now, those people who can do private diplomacy are doing private diplomacy. Those people who can do public diplomacy are doing public diplomacy. What can we do for the hostages? Back in the 1940s, Russia was sealed tight. No one in, no one out. It was, in my opinion, the world's largest prison. And then there was a crack in the wall. Right after World War II, an agreement was struck between Russia and Poland to allow Polish citizens who fled into Russia during the war to return to their homeland. When the Jewish community there heard about the agreement, they started thinking about how to take advantage of it. And they realized that they could actually forge documents claiming that they were Polish citizens. They could leave Russia, and in no time, a whole industry of forgery sprang up, and a little over 1,000 people successfully crossed the border as Polish citizens, despite the fact that they didn't speak a word of Polish. Sorry if I don't turn off my phone, it's just not going to stop ringing. But like any secret, eventually it came to an end. The government caught wind of the operation and they shut it down abruptly. Those who orchestrated the escape were thrown into prison, and many people whose families had already left Russia and they were supposed to follow got stuck in Russia for years. They were unable to communicate with their families due to the Iron Curtain and the strong KGB censor. 20 years passed, and one day, the Rebbe, who was so strongly affected and connected and spoke so often about the plight of the Jews behind the Iron Curtain, the Rebbe sent a young man. He was 25 years old. His name was Rabbi Binyamin Katz. I had the great fortune during the time that I lived in Minnesota to spend a lot of time with him. He was already a little older. He passed away a few years ago. And what was fascinating about him and the stories that he's told from his time in Russia is he had he he told me a few times that people called it a photographic memory, but it wasn't really a photographic memory. He had the ability to memorize faces and names. He went around memorizing the names of the Russian Jews because at the time there was this family unification initiative. The problem is the communication was so lost between people that were in Russia and people that were out of Russia that no one knew who was alive and who wasn't. And so he went to Russia and he memorized hundreds of names of people. And then afterwards, he went to Israel and he literally, as he said, he looked in the phone book, found somebody with the same last name. He would call them up and say, "Hey, hi, I just came from Russia and your family there." And they're like, "Well, we don't have any family there." "Well, now you do." And he was able to convince people in Israel for this family unification initiative to allow, and through this initiative, they allowed hundreds, possibly thousands of people out of Russia. He arrives in Russia in 1965. For 20 years, the Russian Jewish community hadn't seen a single friendly face from across the border. It's the last night of his visit. This is what he described. "As I was finished meeting with a young couple, on one of the dark streets of the city, there were two men that grabbed me by the arms. And at first I panicked. I thought it was the KGB. But then they spoke to me in Yiddish. And they said not to be afraid. We went and traveled into the forest. And I recognized by the way they spoke, because they sounded like their father and brother that I knew, and their names were Muchkin and Vyshetsky. These are people who I knew in the free world, and they sounded similar to them. We had a warm conversation, and I brought them regards from their family. And then they turned to me and asked me, 'Tell us, do the Jews in America think about us?' Listen to that question. These are people that are completely cut off from the Western world. What's their one concern? What's their one question? Do the Jews in America think about us? He says, I told them, I don't know what's in every person's heart, but one thing is certain. The Lubavitcher Rebbe thinks about you constantly, and he doesn't let others forget. He told them about one specific Farbrengen on Shavuot of 1964, the year before, when the Rebbe called out in an upset tone, "We are all sitting together," the Rebbe said, "and no one has said l'chaim for the Jews in Russia." The two men, they listened emotionally, and they began to cry. They hugged him, and with that message, they parted. When they finally left Russia years later, they told him that what had given them strength to endure all the difficulties during those years was the knowledge that the Rebbe and the Jews on the other side of the world were thinking about them and praying for their well-being. There were many incredible speeches at the March for Israel in Washington this week, but there was one that really struck me to my core. It always does every time I hear him speak. Natan Sharansky, the refusenik, who sat in prison for 9 years. He got up there and he has this very nonchalant way of speaking that is so powerful and so impactful. He was imprisoned in a Russian jail as a Zionist activist. He said so often the investigators would tell him he was alone, that he was forgotten by everyone, that no one cared about him, that he had failed in his fight against the mighty Soviet Union. And he said there this week at the march, what sustained him were those Jews who came from the United States, from Canada, from Britain to support him in Russia. They proved to him that the KGB was lying. The notion that he was remembered and people were fighting for him gave him strength to continue his struggle. He said that he didn't know what his personal future held, but he was certain in the end that the Jewish people would triumph. I think what the hostages, what the captives need more than anything today is to know that they're not forgotten, that people haven't given up on them, that they're actively sought after, and that everything possible, both privately and publicly, is being done to bring them back home. Recently, I saw a report in the media that right after the IDF took control of a mosque in Gaza, they started from the prayer call loudspeaker, they started playing the Shema Yisrael through the loudspeakers to possibly, if there was a way to alert the captives who might be in the area, letting them know that they're there and they should remain strong. And this is beautiful. But today, we remain with the question, how can regular people like me and you, how can we convey to the hostages, to the captives, the assurance that they are not forgotten? So the Rebbe once cited a teaching in the Talmud that God performed an act of charity with Israel by scattering them amongst the nations. It's from the Talmud in Pesachim. The Rebbe explained, based on the foremost commentator on the Talmud, Rashi, also the foremost biblical commentator, that this was done so that we could never be annihilated together. Now, I know it's a little morbid, but what Rashi says is that since the Jewish people are dispersed and scattered across several countries, that no single nation has the ability to annihilate them. And it also prevents individual nations from trying to kill the Jews under their control as well. It's not my favorite answer. It happens to be probably a true answer, but I like to focus on the positive and uplift. So let's think about this not only on a physical level, but also on a spiritual level. The Rebbe said that when one country imposes restrictions on the observance of a mitzvah or on Torah study, the Jews in the other countries are able to observe those mitzvahs. So the Torah and the mitzvahs are never fully extinct. They're always continuing. In simple terms, the dispersal ensures the survival of the Jews, not only physically, but also spiritually. But the Rebbe takes it a step further, and this blew my mind. There's a Jewish concept that's called machshava mo'elet, effective thoughts. What is this concept? It corresponds to, I guess, what would be called in secular terms, mental telepathy. It's a type of perception on a sensory level that enables a person to consciously or maybe even subconsciously transmit thoughts, transmit emotions and feelings to another person. It's the ability to transfer thoughts and feelings from one person to another. The Rebbe explained that when we fulfill a mitzvah that someone else cannot perform, and we think about that person, it gives them the strength, it gives them the courage to withstand the difficult situation and to strengthen them. I mean, this is unbelievable. There are people, hostages right now, who want to do certain mitzvahs, who want to do certain things. We can do those things for them. Have them in mind, and it affects them. Imagine a woman lighting Shabbat candles and thinking not only of herself, but also for a specific hostage who's unable to do the same thing at the moment. Her thoughts empower that hostage to survive the loneliness, to survive the challenges, because she intrinsically gets to feel that someone else is thinking about her. Or when someone puts on tefillin and thinks about the hostages who cannot put on tefillin because they don't have that ability right now. They don't have tefillin with them. They do it on their behalf. That sends them the strength. Now, there's some people who don't do certain mitzvahs for themselves. And probably for yourself, you wouldn't do that mitzvah. But you have the ability to do it for them now. And it affects them. I never had seen this in writing before. It's such a powerful idea. I mean, within science today, it's become, quantum physics and other types of studies now that are more modern and common have spoken a lot about this. But never have I seen it to this level, that you and I, sitting wherever we are right now, have the ability to do a mitzvah. And when we think of that particular person who is in bondage, who is a hostage right now, who can't do that mitzvah, we can do it for them. And then the Rebbe goes even further. The Rebbe says some people aren't physically captive, but they feel imprisoned by their own inclinations. The Rebbe says, for example, there are people who don't like to pray because it doesn't resonate with them. It's just not their thing. They're good people. They contribute to charity, but prayer's not for them. On the other hand, there are people who love to pray, and they're always happy to complete the minyan, but when it comes to charity, they have separation anxiety. They can't part with their money. They'll donate a kidney quicker than money. Each person is captive to certain feelings and experiences and actions. And sometimes they're unable to help themselves. So when, let's say, someone who loves to pray has that person in mind, they are able to subconsciously influence that person and give them the strength to overcome that inclination. When you're someone who's very generous and you give charity, you can have your friend in mind who may not be as generous. Think about that. Just think about the power that you have right now to affect the hostages by your mitzvahs, by your actions, by your values. If you have something, perhaps that you say, this is my value, but you don't actually do it indeed, for whatever reason, and you can justify it with however you justify it. It doesn't matter right now. But you have the ability right now to do that. I was in a Zoom call on Friday, and someone on the call was showing me behind them. They had a beautiful setup, and I said, "Well, what is that there?" And they said, "Oh," and there was a Israeli flag that was laid out on the table, and the pair of tefillin on top of it. And they said that they're traveling now, and every single day for the past 4.5 weeks, they lay out their Israeli flag and they put on tefillin for the hostages. And he said this has been his longest streak of putting on tefillin of his life. That's amazing. That's inspiring. And it's great. You don't have to do it for yourself, because maybe yourself, you wouldn't do it. You can do it for them. Now, let me connect it to this week's Torah portion. The power of thought is evident in this week's Torah portion, which was the portion of Toldot. We read about Jacob, quote unquote, stealing the blessings that were intended for his father to bless Esav. And Esav asks him to prepare a meal, and Rivka, the mother, overhears the conversation, and she instructs Jacob, to impersonate Esav and steal the blessings. And in the end, Jacob succeeds and receives the blessings. Now, one of the great questions that is asked on this is why would Isaac want to give the blessings to Esau in the first place? It was common knowledge that Esau was wicked and that Jacob was righteous. The Talmud in Bava Batra actually says that on the day of his bar mitzvah, which also happened to be the day that his grandfather Abraham died, Esav committed the three most severe transgressions on his bar mitzvah: idolatry, adultery, and bloodshed, or forbidden relations and bloodshed. It's so difficult to imagine that his father thought him to be more worthy than his brother, when he clearly was not one that would have been worthy by natural order. One of the answers is that Isaac knew exactly who his boy Esav was, and he wanted to redeem him from his personal captivity. He was hostage to his evil inclination, and Isaac knew that, and he wanted to redeem him. He thought that maybe, just maybe, by granting Esau the blessings, he would empower him to overcome his inclinations, to turn a new leaf in his life. And I think the lesson is obvious. Each one of us has areas where we're free and areas where we feel captive. Our job today is to collaborate, to support one another, to have the hostages, to have the captives in mind, and when we do a mitzvah. And together, may we today hear the good news that all of the hostages have been freed unscathed, and that there should be peace, absolute peace, and no more of this bloodshed and war, no more of this difficult situation, these atrocities, no more. And we should all be able to truly be able to be in a space that we could be free from the slavery, the personal slavery, free from the bondage, free from the difficulties, the things that are holding us back. And Hashem should bless each and every one of us, our families, those we love, those we know, those we don't know. And all of us should be able to see an absolute joy, beauty, and from this, may we all be able to together celebrate in a way that we've never celebrated before. Have a wonderful week, and I hope you enjoyed my little, I would say not as, the moment is the moment, but I tried to give you a little bit of an idea of what I spoke about in the synagogue today. And of course, you're always welcome to join us in person every Shabbat. And whenever you like, have a great evening.